And this ain't Canada, this is native territory. Turtle Island, East Coast is Salish. Fucking colonizers just keep on taking. February 2010 confront invasion. G20 G20, Main Street blazing. Destroy the SPP wherever it gets sick.
Magazine dodam, Mississauga Dow, New Credit Dunji, Num Kage win, Wasson Kabinjabam, Gunishki Babigu, Kadeka Zimwale, we the Bimchina, we Dubnishna, Asia Beja go Fakade, we Jagal Bushna.
If you read the history books, you'd think that history started only when LaSalle sailed down the St. Lawrence. But we had our own forms of government, our own language, our own culture, our traditions, and most importantly, our land. We still have all that. That's what means that we are still a nation. We are saying to the Canadian government, they need to continue to work with us on a nation-to-nation basis. We have many outstanding land claims. We have unfulfilled treaty obligations. We have issues where they're trying to use legislative tactics and policies to erode our rights, such as cutting back on our education of our kids. They are taking kids out of our communities in unproportionate numbers with their child welfare laws, even surpassing the residential school scoop of our children. And we say enough is enough.
Our goal right now is to let the international media, let the world know that everything is not okay in Canada for First Nations people. Right? You know, we're willing to do the necessary things it takes.
Here, those on reserve, off reserve individuals who come to the city to seek a better way of life oftentimes find their way to Council Fire. In Canada today, there's over 500 missing women, 584 to be exact, determined by the Native Women's Association. In March 2010, Stephen Harper cut the funding to the Native Women's Association, that the money that was going to go to the Sisters in Spirit campaign to identify ways and means of protecting women and ways and means of making sure that we don't lose any more. Those missing women have gone as a direct result of the Indian Act. And the Indian Act is alive and well here in Canada today in 2010. Racism is legislated. Discrimination is legislated. It's systematic. How do you lose 584 missing women? You make a direct attack on women and children, those vulnerable. And so when those Indian reserves that have been set aside for the Aboriginal people, Indigenous people to live, haven't grown since they were set aside in the 1800s, yet our populations have. So on those land bases that have infrastructure that's not adequate and housing that's substandard, there still is not enough room for Aboriginal people, Indigenous people, the inherent owners of this country. Yet they're on crowded Indian reserves where they're not being expanded. As a result, they're coming into urban centers and experiencing the same kind of racism and discrimination, maybe even more so, because they don't have friends and family next door to them anymore. They're here in the city. So on this day, as we look around us and we see 250,000 people living on the streets in Canada, I say, go to all of those staff and all of those volunteers who support us at Council Fire to be able to help those who are vulnerable and living on the streets. And Stephen Harper should know this. I believe he does, that those are not my numbers, that is not acceptable, that in Canada today, that conditions for Indigenous people are rated 74th in the world. Those determinants of health have been used to identify those conditions. We're behind the 8 ball at every level and at every turn, and yet we still have to continue to fight for our rights. And I spoke earlier, and I want to bring to the attention of all of us and acknowledge those who have gone before us to stand up and say, and stand up and hold up our duty to creation, to protect each other, to speak for everyone's right to exist as the Creator intended for us to exist. People
whose territory we're on here, and greatly appreciate the people showing up here today to this very important event, which involves, I guess, putting the G8 G20 on notice that we reject what they are up to in terms of trying to consolidate, the power and the wealth at a global level. And we support, as the defenders of the land, the local economies of indigenous people throughout the world. And the indigenous people have always been very powerful in terms of fighting against big government and big companies. In the Canadian court system here in Canada, the Haida case and Delgamuukw and all these different other legal cases, there's always been indigenous people that have been leading the struggle in terms of defending the land from these large corporations. Because I think people have to realize that the G8 G20 does not represent the best interest of people, generally speaking, when you have issues like global warming, where they can't even come up with an agreement in Copenhagen because they do not support the turning over of resource development to local people. They want to keep it always in the hands of the big companies. Also, in terms of these big governments and big industry not being able to protect the ecological biodiversity. And I think it's important that people understand that through supporting indigenous people, you're putting in place a new system of order, that's based upon a more circular basis of economy instead of this vertical economy that the system has been working on, where everything is done by greed and for profit, where the land isn't looked at as our Mother Earth, but looked at as a resource base.
And we call on Canada specifically and other countries in the G8 and G20 to adopt and implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We're calling for the creation of a land claims process in Canada that is respectful towards our nations, and for Canada to respectfully deal with all of the outstanding land claims and land claim processes within the country, and that they abandon the process of making our communities abandon their rights as a precondition for negotiations of any land claims. We call on Canada to stop the criminalization of Indigenous movements who are standing up to protect their rights and protect their lands. We're calling for action on the 584 missing and murdered Aboriginal women across Canada.
Of about 600, and it's along the proposed Enbridge pipeline route. And not only that, I have family at ground zero at the tar sands. So where my father used to hunt and fish and gather, there are now open pit mines that you can see from space. The world's largest energy project is destroying my father's people, my mother's people. In BC, where I live, the proposed pipeline that Enbridge is trying to push on my people, it's threatening the traditional medicines that my great-grandmother, Sophie Thomas, has preserved for me. Ancient knowledge that has been passed down from generation to generation. When I go out to pick those medicines that I need to treat those cancers, those rare diseases and cancers that have been unknown to all of my people, it makes my heart heavy. It makes me come to these events and tell the G8 G20 countries, to tell the major corporations like RBC who are financing the ecocide and genocide of our lands and our people. And I don't just say my people as Indigenous people, I mean all of us, because we are all one. We call ourselves Yinka Dene, people of the earth. That's what we are. We are all...
Okay, we have one more speaker.